Hello there, everyone. It's Christy, and I normally don't do a video on the Mondays, but because I'm planning on going out tomorrow night, I thought I should make sure you guys had some content for this week. And in aid of getting things done, like scratched off my to-do list, I have decided to really finish up things that are outstanding before getting back to my regular schedule. I had planned on doing a summary of Karen Armstrong's last chapter for today's episode, or for today's airing, the video, but I ended up working right through my lunch hour. I'm trying to finish an article up and wrap it up so I can get it submitted to a journal, and I just sort of fell into work today and just went right through and ate lunch at my desk and not had a break. So instead, what I decided to do in order to still scratch things off my to-do list is to read from the thesis, because this is actually my favorite chapter from my thesis. And so it was a nice way to be excited about, doing something even though if it's on the fly. And the reason that I like this chapter so much is because in the previous chapter, we saw some effects of agency and communion on its ability to explain or predict an outcome. But here we're looking at attitudes, and we're going to see the effects a lot more clearly as they have an impact on people's attitudes rather than directly on whether or not they vote or directly on whether or not they support Labor or the Conservatives. And in this chapter, I go through several different attitudes, and today I'm just going to get as far as left-right self-placement, and we'll pick it up with socialist laissez-faire and libertarian authoritarian scales in another video. Getting started. Chapter 5. Sex, Gender, and Political Attitudes. In Chapter 1, I reviewed how previous literature has accounted for the formation of gender gaps. One way is through differences in attitudes on political issues rather than differences in the weight individuals give to their political considerations. One example is the continuing sex difference in American men and women's political preferences. In the most recent U.S. presidential election, 56% of female voters supported Barack Obama, in comparison with 49% of men, and 48% of male voters supported John McCain, compared with 43% of women. Gender gaps may also arise from differences in the salience of issues. In this scenario, the differences arise not only from differences in attitude, but also from differences in the weight or importance the issue has for the individual. In this chapter, I will be investigating whether or not there are sex differences and/or gender differences on a series of measures commonly used to assess an individual's political attitudes. The reader may recall from Chapter 1 that in her research into an ideological gender gap, Pippa Norris concluded that there were no consistent ideological differences in men and women's political views. The result of analysis contained in Chapter 4 indicated that agency and communion, measures of gender distinct from the variable for biological sex, provide a separate and distinct piece of explanatory information in some analyses of vote intention and vote choice. In this chapter, incorporating measures of both sex and gender, I will examine the data to determine whether there are any sex and gender differences in political attitudes when both measures are included within a socio-demographic model. The intention here is not to provide a model which can account for a large amount of the variance in political attitudes, but rather to determine whether, 1, gender measures are statistically significant when they are included in a socio-demographic analysis, 2, sex is significant after controlling for gender, and 3, whether gender measures provide a pattern of consistent coefficients indicative of ideological directions. As with the previous chapter, the measure of emotional vulnerability is included as a control variable as per the recommendations by Ward et al. The measures tested in this chapter have been selected because they are used in typical measures of political attitudes. These measures include the left-right self-placement variable, the libertarian and authoritarian scale, a measure of political tolerance, and the socialist laissez-faire scale. In addition, I include analysis of 2 new scales which were included in our dataset to investigate gendered morality, measures of attitudes on equality and on kindness. In a later section, we will examine the role of sex and gender in political partisanship and partisan preferences. The first series of regression models are conducted upon interval-level variables and use ordinary least squares regression. Drawing upon theory outlined in the preceding chapters and previous findings, I offer two additional hypotheses that will be tested against the evidence. Hypothesis 6. Agency will have a positive and statistically significant relationship with attitudes associated with the political right or conservative attitudes. Hypothesis 7. Communion will have a positive and statistically significant relationship with attitudes associated with the political left or liberal attitudes. As mentioned in the previous chapter, the sociological framework is grounded in the notion that an individual's social context, characteristics, and psychology are important to political behavior. In the previous chapter, I attempted to replicate the sociological model used in political choice in Britain with variables from my own dataset. In this chapter, I am not attempting to replicate any particular model. Instead, I employ as many relevant socio-demographic variables as possible in my exploratory model. I apply consistent model, Model 1 and Model 2, to each of the dependent variables I test throughout this chapter. This model takes the form of: the dependent variable will be some function of a constant plus the coefficient of the effect of age, the effect of being married or not, the effect of what age they left education, whether they're a parent or not, if they live in the north or not, and this is in Britain, not in the UK, in Britain, whether or not they identified as a Christian, where they are in the class schema, ranging from having never worked to being a professional or higher technical worker, income, which ranges from less than £5,000 a year up to more than £50,000 per year, whether or not they have a mortgage and / own their home, whether or not they're a woman or a man, and the scores on their agency, communion, and emotional vulnerability measures. This model includes all possible relevant demographic variables contained in the dataset. The demographic variable north was included in order to provide a geographic control variable into the socio-demographic analysis. The selection of this variable was based upon the results of the previous chapter, in which the coefficients for north were statistically significant in the logistic regression results analyzing whether a respondent would vote conservative or labor. Tables 4.5 and .6. Left-right self-placement. In Chapter 4, I employed as an independent variable a replicated measure of the left-right self-placement as used in the 2005 British election survey. As part of the joint special project on measurement validity, a test was conducted on the influence of numerical versus adjectival response options. Respondents were asked at the beginning of the survey the traditional left-right self-placement question. On a scale of 1 to 7, where 1 means left and 7 means right, where would you place yourself on this scale? Respondents were then shown a scale from 1 left to 7 right and were asked to click the button which indicated their location in generic left-right political space. After a series of questions, respondents were asked the following question. People often describe themselves as being on the left or right wing of political opinion. Would you describe yourself as? Instead of being offered a numerical scale, respondents were prompted with a series of options which described the political spectrum, and the response options were positioned from left to right. Very left wing, 1, fairly left wing, 2, slightly left of center, 3, center, 4, slightly right of center, 5, fairly right wing, 6, and very right wing. That should be 7, not 8. The distributions of responses on the two forms of the question are displayed below in Table 5.1. The two measures are highly correlated, with a Pearson's correlation coefficient of 0.84, significant at the 0.01 level using a two-tailed test of statistical significance. Although highly correlated, they are not perfectly correlated, and so the two measures were analyzed using principal components factor analysis with direct Oberlin rotation, missing cases deleted listwise. The results produced a single factor loaded for the two measures, 0.958 on the component matrix, which was saved as a regression variable and used as the dependent variable in the following analysis. The variables used in these models were checked for normality, linearity, heteroscedasticity, outliers, and multicollinearity. No problems were found. So here again is just comparing the distributions of the frequency statistics for numerical and adjectival left-right self-placement. And generally what you find is that when you ask people the question, if you ask people a question in a survey, whether it's an online survey or a face-to-face survey, as long as it's not a self-administered one where they can go back and check, but anything where they can't go back in time and look at what they said before, then after a few minutes, people will generally forget if you ask a second question, even if you ask the exact same question on the topic. If you ask two questions on the same thing, most people will not remember that they had been asked that question before. And as we see here, that when you have the wording, what you find is that people are a little bit more likely to put themselves in the center. You can see 43 versus 42. And the distributions, I mean, they're pretty close, but there's a little bit of variation. So when you ask people to do it with just numbers, you get mostly the same responses as with words. But as you can see here, let's say this taking this fairly right wing, you get more people identifying as fairly right wing and slightly fewer identifying as right of center. So these are just these are wording tests that we try to use to understand the best and most accurate way to obtain information from people. So that's just FYI. Model 1, Table 5.2, produces a poor fit, with the socio-demographic model only accounting for 4% of the variance in left-right self-placement. 5 variables were statistically significant. The variable with the largest beta was the measure of Christianity, beta equals 0.12, which was highly significant and associated with self-placement on the right. The next largest beta measures were related to an individual's economic situation. Having a higher income and owning a home or having a mortgage were both associated with the political right, beta equals 0.07 and 0.07 respectively. Finally, living in the North was associated with the political left, as was being a woman, beta equals negative 0.04 for both variables, indicating that the variable contributes to the variance explained in Model 1. Although the adjusted R-square does improve with the inclusion of the gender measures, it does though only slightly, from 4% in Model 1 to 5% of the variance explained in Model 2. In terms of the main questions of this thesis, a quick check of the results of Table 5.2 indicate 4 things. 1. The measure of agency is highly statistically significant and is in the predicted direction, beta equals 0.13, evidence in support of H6. 2. The measure of communion is statistically significant and in the predicted direction, beta equals negative 0.04, evidence in support of H7. When included in this model of socio-demographic variables, agency achieves the highest beta of all the variables, indicating it is contributing the most toward explaining the variance in left-right self-placement. And 4. When measures of gender are included, the sex variable ceases to be statistically significant. Let's look now at the results in Table 5.2. So this is an ordinary least squares regression conducted on the dependent variable left-right self-placement, and this was the factor variable, which was a combination of the two measures for attitudinal and adjectival self-placement options, and all of the respondents here, not just voters or anyone in the data set was included in this. So I just want to clear my throat here. The first model, which is Model 1, you can see here, I'm going to go over what I said in the body of the text, but if you remember from my video on statistics for people who are afraid of statistics or whatever I called it, when you want to evaluate the explanatory power of a variable in your model, you ignore the positive or negative signs and you just put them in rank order from biggest to smallest. And when you do that with this model, you can see that in terms of explaining why someone places themselves on the left or the right, when you include where they live, here this being the North, when you've got their Christian, self-identified Christians, when you know what their income is and you know about the mortgage, you know if they're a woman, it would appear here that being a Christian explains the most about someone's right-leaning self-placement, because this is positive and the scale goes from 1 to 7, so positive equals toward the right, negative means toward the left. The next important variables would be their income and mortgage, and then finally you would have these location and sex variables, and you would think, yeah, look, there's a sex difference here because women are more likely to put themselves on the political left than men in this data set. In Model 2, when we include agency and communion, you can see that the effect is that the explanatory beta for Christian stays the same, The income one goes down a little bit. The mortgage one goes up a little bit, but most and north stays the same. So these coefficients are relatively stable. So we've got basically these are perfectly stable, north and Christian across the two models. Income is for the most part stable. It goes down by from 0.07 to 0.06. Mortgage becomes slightly important, but crucially for my thesis, the sex variable stops being significant. And instead of sex being significant, what we see are that agency and communion are behaving in the theoretically predicted directions, and that agency now has become the biggest source, the biggest beta, has the biggest beta of all the variables in the model. So it's having the most effect. And it's, so it's in the theoretically predicted direction, and it suddenly trumps all the other variables in the model. And we have communion here at 0.04, which is still within what social scientists consider a tolerable amount of error. That would be 0.05 is the cutoff, and that would say if we did 100 times where we did the same survey and we repeated it 100 times, 5 times out of those 100 we would get coefficients that were different from what was actually happening in the population. Whereas in the case of agency, we'd have to repeat that same thing 1,000 times, and we'd only find one example where it would be not what was in the population. So we're really confident about agency, and we're still confident to call it statistically significant on communion, but agency is clearly like a very strong factor here, and it's a highly significant one. These results suggest, contrary to Pippa Norris's original conclusion in 1986, there appears to be an ideological gender gap in Britain. The difference, of course, is that the ideological gender gap can only be detected when using appropriate and conceptually accurate measures of gender. Ideological gender differences cannot be detected when using measures of biological sex. To determine whether or not it can be said that there is an ideological gender gap in Britain, more analysis on other traditional measures of political attitudes is reviewed below. Actually, it should be reviewed below. And as you can see, next time we're going to be looking at socialist laissez-faire scale, which was developed by these three, by Anthony Heath, Jeff Evans, and Jean Martin, as well as examining the libertarian authoritarian scale. So that I will leave till next time. I can leave you guys on a cliffhanger because my stuff is so exciting. And yeah. So with that, I'll say thanks for your time and attention. We'll be carrying on with this as and when I can. There is only chapter 7 to do, chapter 5, which we're going to do. And then as you can, I'll actually just take this. Yeah, this very British gender gap, we're not going to be doing that because, as I said, the real reason that the most important finding for this is the way in which agency and communion behave when included in models. In terms of their impact on the sex variable. And this was really, I needed to have at least 60,000 words in order to have my thesis be considered done. And so in order to make sure that I met that word count, I added another chapter, and it had some value to it, but it doesn't really tell more of the story than I'm going to have told you by the end of chapter 5. So once, and it's long, oh my gosh, is it long? It goes on and on and on. So then we're going to be skipping that one, although I might make reference to it. And then the final thing that we have to do after chapter 5 is the conclusion. And that is not quite as long. What does it go from page 174 through till 174 until 183. So it's only 10 pages long. And then I will also have touched on whatever findings I had from chapter 6, and then it just gets to the bibliography, and the bibliography goes on and on and on and on and on and on and on because it's a thesis. So it's basically kind of like doing a book, which is why it took me 3.5 years to research and analyze and write. Yeah, so that's it really. Thanks you guys for watching all the way to the end, and I will see you the next time I do a video. You guys are awesome. We'll see you later.